Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back from the break. While others are still coming in, let us sing number 335, while others are coming into the auditorium. 335. Come sing, my soul, and praise the Lord.
Redemption.
welcome back from the break. We're so glad to see so many out to the conference, to the first gathering we've had since 2019, to the Toronto Easter Conference. So nice to be back together to enjoy the fellowship and to congregate in this fashion. Our speakers, the last part of the conference today is Mr. Lorne, brothers, Mr. Lorne Langfeld and Brother Frank Sona. Lorne will be opening up the meeting. But before that, let's sing another hymn, number 159. My Redeemer, oh, what beauty is in that lovely name up here. 159. My Redeemer, oh, what beauty is in that lovely name appear. None but Jesus in his glory shall the honored title wear. My Redeemer, Brother Lorne Langfeld will come up to the platform, and there'll be a hymn between the two speakers.
My good brethren that asked me to come today asked me to do a difficult thing. Give a report on the work. So, I want to start by reading in Revelation chapter 20. And I'm going to read something that was actually part of a children's meeting many years ago. Might seem strange to some, but it was wonderful to me. I'm supposed to talk today about what activity has been going on, but I want to backtrack a bit and talk about why. If we know the why that's behind things, we might find it more encouraging to move ahead with the what we should be doing. So, Revelation chapter 20, and reading from verse 14, "And death and hell were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. And whosoever was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire." Those two verses were burned into my mind on a Friday many years ago, with the result that late that night, in desperation, I suppose you'd say, I rested in the finished work of the Lord Jesus Christ for me. I started off my life with Christ with this impression of the lake of fire and the second death. That stayed with me. I want to turn to Romans chapter 1. After we get saved, we begin to grow. We've heard about some baby steps, and certainly some of our early steps were very small baby steps. But one of the things that I was impressed with early on was Paul's expression of his own feelings. In Romans chapter 1, he says in verse 14, "I am debtor both to the Greeks and to the barbarians, both to the wise and to the unwise. So as much as in me is, I am ready to preach the gospel to you that are at Rome also. I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation, to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first and also to the Greek." The word power there in verse 16 is interesting. It's the same word that we would get our word for dynamite from. We know what dynamite can do, at least some of us do. The gospel of God is the gospel of Christ is the power or the dynamite of God unto salvation. In chapter 9 and chapter 10 of Romans, in the first verses of each chapter, he expresses his heartfelt inner feelings towards others that are not saved, particularly his fellow Jewish connections. And so that's in the background. We have heard today that we need to be unified. And we certainly do. We have been fragmented for 2 years or more, and we need to be unified. We also need to pay attention to the fact that we only have one shot at this. One life. Give it all you got, because you won't get another chance. And so, early on, when I was young, I guess I'd have to confess I was pretty green. I didn't know much. Didn't have too much help like some of you might have had. I'm very thankful for some neighbors that weren't far away that were a big help to me. But I began to give out tracts. Now, in 1963, there was a couple in Toronto who printed a tract. Some of you may remember it. Simple black and white. On the front was the question, "Are you saved?" And I would get them by the case. And some here might smirk at what I did, but I rode my bicycle around Scarborough and Agincourt Mall, Cedar Brae Mall, etc. And I put tracts underneath the windshield wipers. In the summer, when people left their window open a wee bit, I'd shoot it in through so it would land on the seat. And so I never heard of any results. 1963. Now things changed and we began to do other things, worked with others, tent meetings and so on. So let's turn to Ecclesiastes now. And I want to turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 11. Some of these verses here will be known well. Ecclesiastes chapter 11 and verse 1. Cast thy bread upon the waters, for thou shalt find it after many days. Give a portion to 7 and also to 8, for thou knowest not what evil shall be upon the earth. Verse 4. Verse 4. He that observeth the wind will not sow, like today. Some said it's too windy to go outside. If you pay attention to the weather, you may not sow. Verse 6, in the morning sow thy seed, and in the evening withhold not thine hand, for thou knowest not whether shall prosper either this or that, or whether they both shall be alike good. Now let's come to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5. I'll put these pieces together in a minute. Matthew chapter 5, and looking down at verse 14. Ye are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick, and it giveth light unto all that are in the house. Let your light so shine unto men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. In verse 14, did the Lord Jesus Christ ask the disciples if they wanted to be the light of the world? Did he ask them if they were? Was he checking to see if they were interested? No, the Lord Jesus Christ made a statement, a very emphatic statement. It's as though he was pointing a finger at them. The emphatic pronoun, you are the light of the world. I know that at times I have been dim, and you might think the same. Nevertheless, we are the light of this world. We have a responsibility as well as opportunity to shine in this world for our Lord Jesus Christ. And so, in my own life, I made some various steps and ended up doing more and more gospel work, and eventually was commended to the Lord's work. One of the ways that we began to reach out early on was at fairs. International Plowing Match. First one was in 1975 that I went to in Oshawa. And the Royal Winter Fair, we had a booth there for about 15 or 16 years. An interesting incident stands out there. So we took the gospel not only to the community in what you might say traditional ways, in tent meetings and particularly in children's meetings, but also in a little different way, taking the gospel into fall fairs and so on. And so I want to mention an incident that ties in with what I spoke of first, giving out tracts. 20 years went by from when I was giving out tracts in the Agincourt parking lot. 1983, we had a gospel booth at the Aurelia Fall Fair. A family came along, father and mother, and son and daughter-in-law and 2 little children. They came by the booth and they took their time. Now, normally I would put out a tract that I have a good supply of. I normally wouldn't put out a tract that I only had maybe a dozen or so left. I'd keep that to give out personally. But for some reason that morning I had put out my last few copies of that tract from many years before, Are You Saved? This family came along and the young man looked the table over. And he reached over, he put his finger on that tract. He looked at me and he said, 20 years ago I picked that up off the ground in the Agincourt Mall. He got saved. He went off to Montreal to university, met his then wife there, and they lived in Montreal. They were just back in Ontario for a visit, just a visit with his parents. And for entertainment, decided they'd all come out to the fall fair. You know, brothers and sisters, that was encouraging to me. And I tried to pass that encouragement on to others. For all of the, I don't know how many tracts I got from this couple that were in Toronto and gave them out that way when I was quite young, never heard of any results. And there was somebody that had gotten saved. The Royal Winter Fair is another example. My wife remembers long days when I would be gone at 4 in the morning and not get home till 11:30 or so at night. We used Walter Kimber's texts. We used thousands of them, literally thousands every day. And some people came and got a text because the frame was just the right size for a diploma. Now, that's not the funniest one. That was pretty common. But one man, I found out later, took 12 of them home because he had 12 horses in his barn and he wanted it for the name over each stall. Nevertheless, he read every verse. A lady came by around 1987. She picked up a text because she had a diploma. She wanted to put it in. But when she got home, she looked at it and it just struck her. This is from the Bible. You can't throw it out. But she sure didn't want to look at it either. So she put it in the bottom of a drawer. And 20 years of her life went by and she was up and down, and circumstances were such that she was moving and cleaning out drawers, and anyhow she found this text. It had gotten wet in the intervening times. The paper was all wrinkled and discolored and yellow around the edges. But she read it. And she got saved. And she showed up in London. She went to the Gospel Hall at Highbury and asked, she took the text actually to the hall. And I don't know who she asked, but she asked somebody, can I get this fixed? They said, sure. Go down and see Roy Beckett. She went to see Roy Beckett. Roy says, I can give you a new one. Lady didn't want a new one. I want that one. So Roy's wife They took the frame apart. She ironed the text, smoothed it all out, give it back to the lady. Now, I would pick up text from Roy. He used to make some painted frames and stuff like that. So I was down to pick up text for another fair, and Roy wanted to tell me this interesting story. Roy had no knowledge of us having a booth at the Royal Winter Fair. He didn't know anything about that. So he told me this very interesting story. It was a real encouragement to me. Now, brothers and sisters, you and I may have done something like that. Spoken to somebody, given a gospel tract to somebody over the years. And as far as you know, there was no result at all. And Satan's going to tell you, you know what, it was just a waste of time. Satan's going to tell us how foolish you are. Putting yourself out front and talking to people about the Bible. He does not want us to shine like a light. He wants to put us under some kind of a basket or a covering of some sort so that our light can't be seen. Brethren and sisters, we need to get out with the gospel. We have been disabled for about 2 years. And damage has been done. And we need to get back at it. Tent meetings, children's meetings, gospel meetings, whatever. Now, I'll get a little bit to this report business. So, there was another event that we went to. My wife and I went for 27 years, Woodstock Wood Show. Some people did get saved. But one thing that stands out in my mind was a couple that were already saved when we met them. They didn't know much. And they were struggling. They were trying to read the Bible, trying to learn. So we only saw them once a year normally. And every time that Vern and Shirley would come, they'd have a list of questions. So we'd stand around. What I had at that booth was a collection of wood samples that you would read of in the Bible. So woodworkers were interested in that. All kinds of woodworking people came, and they wanted to see all these different kinds of trees, etc. And there was a tract that I titled, What Species Was the Wood? And on it was a diagram of a cross. So if you saw that, what species was the wood, what would come to your mind? Well, a woodworker wants to know what kind of wood was the cross made of. So we took that up in the article. And that's an interesting thing. The tract got used in more ways than I expected. A woodworking shop teacher in London came to me one year and asked, could I use that in my class? So I said, sure. It's not copyright at all. No problem. In his woodworking class in the high school, the students had to research the list that I had on the back of all the trees of the Bible. But he blocked out where I had written what they were used for. So all of his students had to look up all the references and find out what the tree was used for as part of their project. So that was kind of interesting, but they all got a full copy of the tract. See, the teacher was a Christian. So some of the things that we do or could do, we need to get our heads past the idea that we need instant results. We're used to instant things. That's why we had to be told to turn off our cell phones. We are used to instant results, and it doesn't work that way in real life. It doesn't work that way in the Lord's work either. We need to understand that it's like planting a seed. Farmers are planting their crop at this time of year. If you saw a farmer plant a crop, put seed in the ground this weekend, and bring the combine out next weekend, you'd think the man's a fool. Because it doesn't work that way. It takes time. We need to understand that what we do for God very often, probably most often, will take time for that seed of the gospel to develop. But God is working, and we need to do what we might say the initial stages. We need to do the sowing part. And that's where God takes over after that. So, today, what do? In March of 2020, we actually had a gospel booth set up at a home show on the Thursday, and arrived Friday morning to a sign on the door saying, "It's canceled. All the exhibitors, take your stuff out immediately." 12 events were canceled right then. Boom, 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 one after the other. Gospel meetings were canceled, for the most part. Different activities that we were used to in the assembly were all canceled. A lot of things in our everyday lives were canceled. Were the funeral homes closed up? Was death canceled? No, not at all. In fact, that part of living or that part of society never skipped a beat. Death only increased. Nothing was canceled. People continued to exit life and go out into eternity without Christ. And we were disabled to a great extent. But then we start to think, what can we do? Well, we could have meetings on Zoom or some other technology. And so we began to have a time of singing and fellowship, and some assemblies had a ministry meeting or a Bible reading and so on. Many of us in the Lord's work, we were called on to have a Zoom ministry meeting. Sometimes it was difficult because you wanted to take up something that took 2 or 3 nights, but it could still be done. Children's meetings, that's what I found the most difficult. I'm not used to looking at a screen and looking at just a couple of children at once. I'm used to being interactive with the kids. But it was workable. It was a struggle, but it could be done. And gospel meetings continued. In fact, actually, we had access to more gospel meetings and more ministry meetings than ever before. We could sit at home and catch the gospel meeting in Corner Brook, Newfoundland, at 6:30 our time, and then we could catch another gospel meeting later if we wanted. And so we did, as believers, we did try to do something. But it wasn't enough. It didn't satisfy the need we felt. So we looked around. I had a stockpile of texts in the basement and materials stockpiled for fairs. They're no good sitting there. If the Lord comes, they'll still be sitting there. That's no good. So we started mailing. And we mailed, and we mailed, and we mailed. And others did the same. We were able to mail out literature to communities around. In our case, we bought an FM transmitter in May of 20, and we began to have drive-in gospel meetings that summer in the same place that we normally would have had tent meetings. And so we've done that 2 years in a row now, and hopefully this coming summer we'll get back to regular tent meetings in that location. And another thing that we have been doing for a number of years, actually, it's not a result of COVID, we have some gospel texts up on billboards. Some people will notice that there are bins in locations. Typically, you'd see a couple of recycle bins, and on each side of the container of recycle bins, there would be some advertising. The first time we tried to get onto one of those bins, I was very delicately turned down because I wanted to put a Bible verse on. And I guess I thought maybe I would act like the Apostle Paul a little bit and mention something legal. And so I did make mention of the fact that it was against our civil rights to deny me that access. And I never heard anything more, and I didn't pursue it anymore. But time went by, and eventually we got word that there was a change in management, I guess. Anyhow, I was offered an opportunity to put a gospel text on a set of bins. So we have that in place, actually in Coboconk, in a strategic spot. If you drive into the building that's used for the library and some community activities and the service building for the township, you have to drive right past that bin. And there's a big text there. It's actually on both sides. So you drive in, you see it. You drive out, you see it. And a billboard. Billboard is 8 feet high, 16 feet long. You can't miss it. Driving along Highway 35. There's others around. So that's just, you might say, a sample. There's a couple of ideas. We have all seen gospel texts along the roadway at times. Gospel text publishers still have materials available, still have some places where texts can go. It's a good way. Years ago in Goodwood, there was a gospel text on each end of the building of the gospel hall. And people drove past going on their way to Toronto to work every day, back and forth, back and forth. One day a man stopped and got out, and he came up to the shop up above where Fred Smith was working, putting together texts for Walter Kember. And he came in and he said, I just want to tell you, I drive past those Bible verses every day. I read one when I go to work and the other one when I come home. And he wanted to let us know that he'd gotten saved. Brothers and sisters, there isn't one of us here or anywhere, there isn't a Christian anywhere in the world that can do nothing. Now, there's none of us that can do everything, so we don't get our heads swelled up a bit. But every one of us can do something for God. Every one of us, without exception, younger or middle-aged or older, every one of us can do something for God. And if you are sort of searching or seeking for ideas, talk to others. Others might have ideas. In fact, you might find that others are wondering the same thing. What can we do to reach out with the gospel? And 2 or 3 people put their ideas together, and maybe you come up with something that will work for you in your area, in your experience. But whatever the case may be, we need to get back at the gospel. And I'm encouraged Some of the fall fairs and so on that we've been going to for many years are scheduled back again. One of the events that I've gone to a number of years, it adds up as you get older, but it's an automotive flea market. And I mean, I remember some people saying to me, "What are you going to go there for?" It's just the wrong atmosphere. Well, I'll tell you, there's lots of unsaved folk go through. And you don't have to listen very much to find out what their state of mind is. There's a man that I think of now. Incidentally, his father was in an assembly here in Toronto. But this man was called the black sheep of the family. He went by. One time when I guess I was out at the washroom or something, anyhow, he picked up a John 3:16 text. The next year when I saw him go by, he kind of waved and he didn't say anything. Then another year he came by, and as he was going past the end of the tent, he pointed to John 3:16 on the wall and he says to me, "I can't tell you what that verse means to me now." And away he went. It's gone. And I'm, "Come back here." He wouldn't come back. It took 5 years before I found out his name. That's the way it works sometimes. But he had gotten saved, and him and his wife were trying to find a place that they could attend, that they could go. And he would come back to me and he'd ask questions, and we'd discuss from the scriptures. And actually, as far as I know, they never actually found a place because they were so isolated where they lived. But brothers and sisters, we can do a work for God, and we may not see results, or we might enjoy the pleasure of seeing or hearing of results after many years. If the seed isn't sown in the first place, it'll never produce a crop. It is our responsibility to sow the seed. So, brothers and sisters, may God encourage us all to do that.